good afternoon, everybody. I will continue today on the lecture about internal migration, but I just wanted to show you here on our website, I posted the final assignment 3. And so it's same style as before, 500 words. And it's going to be, the topic is going to be about migration, or more specifically international migration, this next chapter that we're going to discuss. Based on the course material, what are the major effects of immigration of low-skilled workers on the US labor market? Explain whether previous public policies intend to deal with undocumented immigrants were based on scientific studies or general perceptions about immigration. How these policies affect the migration patterns and composition of the population by race, ethnicity, and nativity. Do differentials between immigrants and US-born population in terms of education attainment, labor market skills, health outcomes, crime rates, as well as other socioeconomic and demographic outcomes justify negative perception about immigrants, and why? And the purpose is the same as before. Discuss these questions not based on your own perceptions, but on the discussions that we are doing in the classroom based on the textbook and other course material that I include in the lectures. So it's based on scientific studies. And the submissions is done the same way on Canvas, and I also can detect plagiarism with the Turnitin tool. And it's gonna be due, so our last class, it's on April 29th, Thursday. On the following Tuesday, it's our final exam on May 4th. And the final exam is gonna be open from 1 to 8 p.m., 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. Once you start the final, you have 2 hours and 30 minutes to complete it. The previous exams, you had only 1 hour and 15 minutes. Now it's going to be more, 2 hours and 30 minutes, and the same 40 questions based on material that we have been seeing since after exam 3. So it's going to be pretty much only internal and international migration. But this assignment here is due on the same day as the final, but at 12 p.m. at noon. Some people didn't pay attention on the deadline of the previous assignment. So the deadline is at noon on the same day as the final exam, and the final exam starts being open on Canvas at 1 p.m., 1 hour after that, until 8 p.m. But as you know, once you start it, you have a time limit. But now you're going to have much more time to answer the question. 2 hours and 30 minutes, that's the standard of the university. So I just follow that standard. The difference is that instead of doing a cumulative final exam, I just cover the topics since since after exam 3. Well, so that's the same thing. If you have any questions, please let me know, or you can email me about the assignment.
I put it in the chat, but I guess I'll just have to hear. When will assignment 2 grade be posted?
I will post it before, like 1 week from now. It's gonna be my deadline, right?
Okay, and then, I'm sorry, in addition to that, for the exam, since it's so much longer, I mean, I don't know if I'm even allowed to ask this, but is there a reason why it's so much longer, or is it more comprehensive material that we have to input via like?
No, it's the university rule. It's just like if you go to the university website, if you go to the university website here, so we are on the screen, and then for the final examinations, so we are on spring 2021, and if you click here, May 4th, Tuesday, those are the days. This is technically the day that we're supposed to have it, because our class goes from 3:15 to 4:30 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Right. So the final exam time is supposed to be from 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. So the university rule is that final exams, they last for 2 hours and 30 minutes. That's the standard in the university, the final exam week. So I have to give you 2 hours and 30 minutes to complete the final exam. But instead of putting more questions into the exam, I just keep the same format as exams 1, 2, and 3. So the final exam technically is easier than the previous exam. The same amount of questions, the same style. And if you go to the course website again, instructions about online quizzes and exams, this PDF file here. Here I also mentioned that for exams, for example, you have 1 hour and 15 minutes to complete the exam. And final exam, 2 hours and 30 minutes. So on quizzes, you have 2 minutes and 30 seconds per question. On exams, 1 minute and 52 seconds. The final exam, you have on average 3 minutes and 45 seconds per question. So you have more time to answer each question. So you can look at your notes, you can look at everything you want, but just remember that you have that time window there, right? But that's the reason. I'm just following the university rules in terms of how long time the exam should last. And that's supposed to be 2 hours and 30 minutes. And I'm a little more flexible because I don't open at 2 and close at 4:30. I open at 1 and close at 8 p.m. Then you can choose whatever window of 2 hours and 30 minutes between that. Cool. Yeah, so I will post the grades for assignment 2 by Tuesday this coming week, so April 27th. And then you have 2 weeks to complete assignment 3 from now. Goody. So in the previous class, I was talking about this discussion of I was talking about previous trends on internal migration in the US. And then I started talking about what we expect internal migration to be in these coming years based on what we have been seeing more recent data. And this slide here is pretty much a summary, as I mentioned at the end of the previous class, of this article written by William Frey. He's a demographer based in the Brookings Institute. And he's also a professor at the University of Michigan. And if you just go there, this is the article that he wrote already a while ago in November 2019. For the first time on record, fewer than 10% of Americans moved in a year, based on that question about 1 year of previous residence from American Community Survey. And then there is also this short interview that he gave to NPR that you can listen to it. And based on this information, that's what I summarize here on this slide. So the same thing that I did for fertility, kind of saying that how the current pandemic will affect fertility. So we expect that fertility will decrease in these next years because of the pandemic, because of the economic issues that people are facing. There is a high chance of people having fewer children, as already some data are showing. And this is also expected based on the approximate determinants of fertility that Bonger's discussed. And also mortality in some countries, exactly because of the high levels of mortality due to the pandemic, it might affect life expectancy at birth by 3 years. So decrease in life expectancy in 3 years in the short term in some of those countries, that's a big deal. Decrease in life expectancy from 76 to 73 in Brazil, as some Brazilian demographers expect, that's a huge deal because it puts us closer to really to countries that are really low levels of development as some African and Asian countries. So these were discussions that we did about fertility and mortality. What about migration? Migration, even before the pandemic, this is discussion based from 2019. The US has been experiencing the lowest levels of internal migration since the late 1940s. It used to be 20% in 1950s and 1960s, and usually that's related to a more robust economy. You had job availability in all different parts of the country, so people would move around the country and a much more higher chance of moving to all these different areas. Based on data from the American Community Survey in 2019, this percentage of people that moved in the previous year dropped to less than 10%, more exactly based on estimates from William Frey, decreased to 9.8%. And he's trying to speculate based on his previous knowledge why we have been seeing this decline in internal migration rates. So now we have an older population, and we saw the age-specific migration rates by age, that as we get older, we have lower chances of migrating. Migration rates are higher for people between 20, 35 years of age. Before that and after that, you have lower migration rates. Now, labor market is more homogeneous across the country, so people don't have to move to other areas in the country in order to find jobs, because you have more decentralized economy and job availability throughout the country. And he also mentioned that the 2008 economic recession, exactly because it caused an increase on unemployment rates, it affected the labor market, and that stopped people from migrating to get better jobs. Some studies, on the other hand, there's this study by two economists, Cadena and Kovac. They analyzed that actually areas that experienced really increases in unemployment rate because of the 2008 economic recession, and areas that had higher levels of Mexican immigrants, people born in Mexico moved to the US, areas that have a lot of Mexican immigrants. After the 2008 recession, those people were more likely to move to other areas in the US to find jobs in other places. So this study by these two economists are showing that actually immigrants, more specific in this study, Mexican immigrants, they actually help smooth the negative effect of the economic recession in 2008, because when they left those areas that had lost a lot of jobs, by them leaving, it puts less pressure on the labor market, so more people who stay behind can get jobs, and then they try to move to places where they would have better job opportunities. So the economic recession, in one sense, overall, make the internal migration rates decline, and on the other hand, different subgroups of the population, they tend to be more likely to migrate within the US because of the economic recession. That's actually good for the local labor markets. You remember in the new classical migration theory, people moving from areas they are losing jobs and going to others kind of create a spatial equilibrium between these areas. And also he mentions that with the increase of telecommuting and jobs from home, people can work even in a different city where their companies are located and don't need to move to these other places. And that's really, really interesting, because these reasons here for decline of internal migration, he explained them in this article and in this interview from 2019, before the pandemic. Older population. Now, the population in the US in this next decades, will it continue to be older? Yes, we expect the population to continue to be older because fertility keeps declining, and also declining because of the pandemic as well. different areas in the country are developing, and we still going to continue to have this more homogeneous labor market across the country with the more decentralized labor market in the US. The economic recession in 2008 was really serious, but it was less severe than what we experience now because of the pandemic. So the pandemic affected the labor market by making people lose their jobs. So unemployment rates increased a lot and earnings declined in a much stronger way now because of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021 than in 2008. So what we expect is that exactly because of the pandemic, it might affect internal migration in a negative way. Telecommuting and jobs from home. The economic recession did not affect telecommuting jobs from home in any significant way, but the current pandemic is affecting that a lot. Right now, we have 45 students enrolled in this class. After the winter storm in February, we had only 2 students, Hannah and Aaron, coming here every day, and now we have peers coming as well. And so we have, like, out of 45 students, 3 students in the classroom. All the other students either watching on Zoom or the recorded lectures on YouTube. Just to show that even this technology of online teaching, and this I'm just talking about school, developed a lot within a year, right? So now, and that's not just related to university, all these different jobs that we have been seeing, we have seen people working from home, people having Zoom meetings, people having all sorts of activities related to work done from home. By staying at home, people don't have to move, either don't have to go to work in the same city or don't have to move to another city if they get another job opportunity. Before the pandemic, William Frey was expecting the internal migration could have an increase again. So increasing from around 9.8% to maybe around 12% per year. But that prediction that he tried to think, it was done before the pandemic, but probably it could go even lower than 9.8% in this next decade, right? The latest data that we have from the American Community Survey is exactly 2019, that's the available. And like now in the fall, we might have the release of the 2020 American Community Survey, and then we can see the trends on internal migration based on that data. And that optimistic point of view might not become true exactly because now we had the pandemic since last year. Okay, so that's just interesting to see how the pandemic has effects on the 3 demographic components: fertility, mortality, and migration, right? And the next discussion here that I do, and this is like outside of textbook, and this is some results based on a research project that I have been working on. I have been trying to estimate internal and international migration for smaller areas in the US. And for these specific examples that I'm going to show here, I'm focusing only on internal migration, not international. When people move from one area to the other, they are usually influenced by people that live around them. People that live around them might tell them where there are good places to go in terms of job and education opportunities, but just not people immediately around them in the same county or in the same area. But we could also have an influence in a larger area around where these people live. When you take into account the influence of neighboring areas on the chances of people from a specific area to migrate, we are doing an analysis of spatial association applied to migration, right? So in spatial association analysis, we recognize that people are not randomly distributed over space. People are concentrated in specific areas because they know people in those areas, because they have some identity with them. We have been seeing already discussions about race segregation. We also have socioeconomic segregation. People with better socioeconomic status, they tend to live in specific areas. People with lower socioeconomic status, they cannot afford expensive houses. They live in other houses, in more affordable houses. But not only that, where they live right now, also where people move from to where they move to is influenced by people surrounding them. So when we have a large number of spatial observations, when we divide, for example, the US in several different areas, smaller areas, then we can see the influence of one area into the other. If we divide the US only in 50 states, that influence is not so strong because we have these big geographical areas, and the influence, for example, of Oklahoma on Texas, it's not really well defined. It would be better to divide these states into smaller areas. And that's the intention that we have in this research project. The assumption of stationarity or structural stability over space is highly unrealistic, with the idea that people are not randomly distributed over space. We already saw since the beginning of this semester that people are more concentrated in the east and west coast of the US and fewer people living in the middle areas, right? So there is this non-random distribution of the population over space. And one way to analyze whether people are randomly distributed or not is doing exploratory spatial data analysis. It's the predominant approach to assess the degree of spatial association when we ignore the potential structure instability. And this analysis, this exploratory spatial data analysis, is based on this global statistic called Moranzai. For example, I can analyze migration. I can divide the US in several different areas. In my exercise here, I divide in around 1,000 areas. The areas that I mentioned before to you, the PUMAs, P-U-M-A, the public use microdata areas. These are areas of residence of people in the US that we can get this information from the American Community Survey in public available data. The EPUM's website, we can get that, ipums.org, that I showed to you when we were in the lecture about sources of demographic information. If we divide the US in 1,000 areas, we can see, are people randomly distributed in the US? We can estimate one number, one statistic that will give us whether people are distributed in the same way or if people are moving in the same way among all these 1,000 areas. And that's the Moranzai statistic. But the Moranzai statistic, if you think, it's kind of an average of these overall flows that exist around these 1,000 areas in the US. There is this other measure that we analyze for each one of these 1,000 areas, whether they are different than the others in terms of a specific variable that we want to analyze. And we can apply that to migration. And that's called the local indicator of spatial association, LISA. We get the information for each one of these areas. We get a statistic and we compare it into the surrounding areas. And if areas close to each other have the same statistic, have the same Lisa value, we are saying that those areas form a cluster because they have the same indicator for based on that statistic. They have the same level for that statistic, for the Lisa. If one area has a value for Lisa and the surrounding areas have the opposite value, we have a spatial outlier. If they have similar values, we have spatial clusters. If we have different values of areas really close to each other, we call that spatial outliers. The interesting thing about Lisa, it allows for the composition of global indicators. We have an indicator for each one of the areas that we are doing the analysis, not just one for the whole country. This analysis here can be done for any socioeconomic demographic indicator that you might have. For example, if you estimate total fertility rates for 1,000 areas in the US, you divide the US in 1,000 areas, you estimate total fertility rates for each one of those areas. And then you want to see which areas close to each other have similar values, either high fertility or low fertility. You want to see if they are similar or different. You can estimate life expectancy at birth to the same 1,000 areas and see if they are clusters of high or low life expectancy at birth or differentiations among neighbors. For this exercise that I'm going to show here, I'm going to show these indicators applied for migration. So we can do for fertility, mortality, migration, income, educational attainment, average years of education. We can do for percentage of people married, any indicator that you might have. You can implement this methodology, right? What's interesting about this methodology is that it analyzes autocorrelations in the space for each one of these local areas. So it allows us to see if one specific area has a high value for a specific indicator and is surrounded by areas with high levels. If one area has a high level for one indicator and is surrounded by areas with high levels for that same indicator, that area is classified as being a high spatial cluster. It's a cluster of areas with high levels for that specific indicator. Low is the opposite, an area with low levels for a specific indicator surrounded by areas with low levels. Again, for this exercise, I'm doing this analysis for migration. This can be done for anything. Could be percentage of people living under the poverty level in each one of these areas in the US. And then I could see areas that have really high levels of poverty surrounded by high, or low levels of poverty surrounded by low. As I said, it could be fertility, could be mortality, could be education, can be marital status. It can be percentage of non-Hispanic white people for each one of these 1,000 areas. Areas that have high percentage of non-Hispanic white surrounded by high levels of non-Hispanic white, and the ones with low surrounded by low. Any indicator that we have information for each one of these local areas. And then we have the opposite, areas with high levels for a specific indicator surrounded by areas with low levels, and areas with low levels for a specific indicator surrounded by areas with high levels, which are called the spatial outliers. These colors here, the dark red, dark blue, and then pink and light blue, this is the standard that it's usually used by geographers, by demographers that use this specific methodology. And it's the standard colors that you get when you use this software called Geoda. And Geoda is a free software that if you have information, if you have a shapefile, a map with information, indicators for specific areas within your map, you can put this information to this software package that you can download from this website and estimate these local indicators of spatial association, the LISA. And the reference to what is high and low is relative to the mean of the variable. It should not be interpreted in absolute sense. These clusters and outliers, high, high, low, low, high, low, and low, high, it's compared to the overall mean of that variable. So it's relative to what you have in that specific year, in that specific overall geographical area, in this case here for the US. So like I said, you can do this analysis for any variable that you have on space. You could have, for example, information about how many houses are in specific areas, how many buildings are in specific area, how many restaurants are in specific area. And that would give you the number of the areas that have high levels of restaurants surrounded by high levels of restaurants, right? And in that case, if you're just looking at the number of restaurants in this example, or houses or buildings, it's good to get a rate divided by the size of the population. Otherwise, you're just getting the information for the population density. For this analysis that I did here, I updated for the 2019 ACS, but the slides here just show up to the 2017. We get internal migration rates for several areas in the US. What I told you, the public use microdata areas, the PUMAs. That's the lowest level of geographic aggregation available in public data. And I got these on EPUMS, right? EPUMS.org. So based on ACS, we have information like where people live, what are the areas of current residence. And the PUMAs in 2017, and since 2012, they are around 2,351 areas. So it's around 2,300 areas of PUMAs. But why have we been talking about 1,000 instead of 2,300? Because also based on this public available data, we have information about previous residents. But if someone moved from a previous area into the current area, we could maybe be able to identify those people because we get into this really small number of people that move between areas. And if we could identify these people that move from one specific area to the other, I could know, oh, this is information about that specific person, that specific household that answer the American Community Survey. So because of confidentiality issues, in order to avoid that, us to identify exactly who are these people who answer the ACS, the Census Bureau grouped some of these public use microdata areas from previous residents, and they grouped in what they call the MIG PUMAs. And then there are around 1,000 MIG PUMAs in the US based on the 2017 ACS. So what we do the same exercise. We group the areas of destination from around 2,300 PUMAs into 1,000 MIG PUMAs. So we know if people moved from each one of these MIG PUMAs 1 year before to another MIG PUMA 1 year later. In this case, from 2016 to 2017. So we are getting information in 2017. If someone lived in 2016 in another area, in another MIG PUMA, and we are able to estimate internal migration rates. Like I said before in the example of restaurants and houses. We don't just estimate how many internal migrants are in each one of these areas. We estimate how many enter divided by the population destination. So I'm estimating in-migration rates. In-migration rates, the number of people that enter an area divided by the population in the area of destination. And as I mentioned in the previous class, that's not the most appropriate demographic rate for migration. The most appropriate would be out-migration, because the people in the denominator should be people who are exposed to the risk of going to the numerator. But here, I'm just getting for each one of the destination areas, how many people entered, and I'm just making it relative to the size of the population in that area of destination, just to have a rate or a proportion. And like I mentioned, so in 2017, there were 2,378 Pumas and 1,005 MIG Pumas, areas of previous residence. So what we do, we just group the Pumas of destination at the same geographic level as the MIG Puma of origin. So I said 2,351, I was wrong, it's 2,378. And then we group them into 1,005. So we are pretty much seeing migration from 1,005 areas of origin to 1,005 areas of destination. So that's a really huge matrix. Matrix with 1,005 rows and 1,005 columns. This is a strategy to homogenize the areas of previous and current residents, so we know exactly where people were in the previous year in 2016 and where they are now in 2017. And we estimated the overall percentage of internal migrants, non-migrants, and international migrants based on this MIG Pumas, people who lived in another MIG Puma in the previous year and are living in another MIG Puma in the current year. And they were around only 5% of internal migrants. But you could say, oh, but William Frey estimated with the 2019 ACS around 9.8%. He probably used another definition of migration. And as we have been seeing this chapter, we can have all these different definitions. That's why I spent some time here to explain how we estimated internal migrants, and was based on this definition of people moving from these 1,000 areas to other 1,000 areas, or moving within these 1,005 areas. And they were around 95% of non-migrants, those who live in the same area in the previous year and are living in the same area in the current year. And around 0.5% of those who lived in another country in 2016 and live in a specific area in the US in 2017. For this exercise here, we excluded international migrants, and we are analyzing only internal migrants and non-migrants, right? So it's pretty much a variable that I'm estimating whether someone is an internal migrant or not, and I count how many internal migrants entered that specific area in 2017, between 16 and 17, and I divided by the population of that area. And this is the result. This is the raw data. This is just showing areas that have low levels of internal migrants. So these areas, the more light colors, they have, just multiply this by 100, have between 1.5 and 4.4% of internal migrants. These areas here, they have between 4.4% and 5.5% of internal migrants. This more orange color, 5.5 to 7.1, and the darker color, 7.1 to 18.4%. And these four groups are divided in quantiles, so we have similar numbers of areas in each one of them. We have 245 MIG Pumas in this first category, 246, 246, 245. And the undefined areas here are usually the islands that don't have any neighbors for this analysis. And when we look at this data here, when we look at this map, this rate of the proportion of internal migrants, people in 2017 that moved to these areas between 16 and 17. We kind of see some pattern. Maybe here we see higher levels of internal migrants and here lower levels, but it's kind of messy. It's kind of difficult to analyze. I prefer messy than Neymar, but for the map, messy, it's difficult. So we have to organize the data, right? I don't know if anybody understood this joke, but if anybody likes real football or how we call soccer, it's difficult to analyze this. It's difficult to analyze this one here. So one strategy to clean this map and organize and see which are the areas that receive more migrants and which areas receive less migrants is to estimate the local indicators of spatial association for this specific variable of proportion of internal migrants. We get this variable here, could be any variable, like I said, could be average income, average years of education for each one of these areas, total fertility rate, life expectancy at birth, proportion of homicides, anything for these areas, right? We are talking about migration. What I just wanted to emphasize is that this methodology can be applied to any one of those rates, not just to migration. I could have done that also to fertility and mortality before. And then what we see that the areas that have high levels of internal migrants and are surrounded by high levels of internal migrants with statistical significance are the ones in the dark red. There are 50 areas, and then we see these areas here, more in the West, and also we see in Texas, and also close to Florida, and then a little bit here in the East Coast. Areas with low levels of internal migrants surrounded by areas with low levels, 91 in total, and then we see here, more like a little bit in Midwest we see, and also in the southern areas. Areas with low levels of internal migrants surrounded by high. So low level, surrounded by high. Low level, surrounded by high, 18 areas in total. And then the pink areas are high areas with high levels of internal migrants, high level of internal migrants, surrounded by areas with low. So the pink surrounded by dark blue. This one here is the light blue surrounded by dark red. We have 18 here and 23 here. And problems with the data, we did not identify 23 areas, and there are 3 areas without neighbors. But here we start to see some picture of how migration is distributed in the space in the US. And now, because ACS has so many social demographic variables, as we saw in these previous lectures, we can break this map for specific subgroups of the population. Then we break here internal migrants by nativity, those that are US born and foreign born. And this map here are the non-migrants that were born in the US, non-migrants born outside, internal migrants born in the US, and internal migrants born outside of the US. So what is this one here? Foreign born internal migrant. Someone born in another country who came to the US. In 2016, this person was living in one specific MIG Puma, and in 2017, that person is living in another MIG Puma. So this person moved at least twice in their life. From another country to the US. In 2016, they were somewhere in the US. In 2017, they were somewhere else in the US, right? And internal migrants are those who change residence between 16 and 17, as I have been saying. This overall pattern here of US-born people, internal migrants, follows a little bit this. It's pretty much, it drives the previous pattern of the previous graph. This one here. This one is the overall. Because most of these people migrating are US-born people. So this result here is really similar to this one here. But then when you look for US-born non-migrants, it starts to give us some interesting information. Here you have areas, the ones in red, that have high levels of non-internal migrants, of people born in the US, surrounded by high levels of those same people. And here, areas with low levels of people, or the lowest relative to the overall mean, low levels of US-born non-migrants, those areas surrounded by low. And remember what I said before, this is relative to the overall mean. Maybe these numbers here of US-born non-migrants, you still have a lot of people there that are born in the US and they live here and they did not move from another area to another area from between 16 and 17. So we still might have a lot of people here who are US-born non-migrants, but relative to the overall mean of this variable in this map, in this specific year, that's where we find the lowest levels. And then we see that's exactly the areas that usually receive more foreign-born people. California, Texas, Florida, like New York, those are areas with the lower levels of US-born non-migrants and exactly the areas that have the highest levels of foreign-born non-migrants. And another interesting thing that I see from here is that we have been seeing a lot this discussion in the US that the 2008 economic recession affect a lot the jobs of people in Midwest. And we have been seeing a lot of discussion also about the manufacturing industries that closed in Midwest and people lost their jobs. But what's interesting is that even people losing their jobs in these areas may be exactly because they are older and they are not willing to move to other areas or try to find other kinds of jobs. These people tend to stay in these Midwestern areas, exactly the ones that lost a lot of jobs in these last decades. And this is pretty much a mirror. This is the opposite. These are areas that have low levels of foreign-born non-migrants compared to the overall mean of this information that's specific here for the US. And these areas in blue have low levels for these people surrounded by low levels of the same foreign-born non-migrants. And where do usually foreign-born internal migrants move to? Same way. California, Texas, Florida, Northeast, and also Northwest, right? And the patterns, as I said, to these people here are similar to the previous slide. The next one. Here, all these maps are for internal migrants. So I took out the maps for non-migrants now. But I broke them down now for specific race ethnicity groups. Non-Hispanic whites, Hispanics, non-Hispanic African Americans, and non-Hispanic Native Americans. For non-Hispanic whites, they have lower chances to migrate into these areas that are in dark blue. So these are all internal migrants. So these are non-Hispanic whites migrating into these areas between 16 and 17. So they have a lower chance of going to the same areas, like in southern areas, New York, Texas, California. And the Hispanic population, they have higher chances of migrating exactly to areas closer to the southern border. And see, this map here for Hispanics is not about foreign-born people. This includes Hispanics born in the US as well. Non-Hispanic Native Americans, they usually have higher chances to migrate to areas where you usually have more indigenous reservations, right? Exactly where you have more indigenous reservations, that's where you have higher chances of finding internal migrants, non-Hispanic, Native Americans. And the map for African Americans, for me, it's really interesting as well. We talked about the Great Migration, the migration that happened between 1910 to 1940, 1950, of people moving from southern areas to northern areas, right? African Americans moving from the south to the north. And over the years, they start to go more into other areas as well. But in more recent years, what you see is the opposite. They have higher chances of going back to southern areas. And they have lower chances to going into all these areas in dark blue, which is, for me, is really interesting. It's like a huge area of the country with low levels of internal migration in recent years of African Americans, right? So it really shows different levels of internal migration for these different subgroups of the population. Cool? And here we could even go further. We could break it down by other variables, other social, demographic, economic variables that we have on ACS. I would just like, for each year of ACS, for each variable, you could generate one map. You get crazy of so many maps you can generate from this, right? But this is just to give you a general idea of that. The next portion is the one that I said was going to be extra. It's about internal migration in China. And I talked to you a little bit already at the beginning of this lecture, and that we are not going to cover in our regular lecture. You can read it, but I'm not going to cover here. I'm not going to include on our quizzes and exams. Okay? Any questions? And then now I will continue and starting on the chapter about international migration. So here, this chapter, I get a lot of information from outside of the textbook, but these initial parts here are similar as a textbook: definitions and concepts on international migration, patterns of world immigration over time, and patterns of immigration in the US or to the US. And then I go into more detail about specific discussions about immigration to the US. Discussion about undocumented immigration, about the proposed southern border wall. I mean, the proposed southern border wall already changed the federal government, but it just brings a lot of debate about how ideology can make people believe that that's an important issue, and it's not, and then it's just a waste of tax money that it would implement on something that's so expensive and so inefficient. So that's the overall discussion here. And then the economic effects of immigration, that's just an exercise using the economist that summarizes all the different ways to estimate the effects of immigrants. Immigrants increase a lot suddenly in a specific area, and that's an example from Miami in the 1980s. He used different methodologies to show that a sudden increase in the number of immigrants in specific areas does not have a negative effect on the earnings of the area of destination. And a final discussion here about simulation of US point system, which is an article that discusses if the US implemented an immigration system in the same way as Canada, how would that affect the educational composition of immigrants in the US? It pretty much says that would not change at all, right? So it's just showing how all these different policy discussions in the US are much more based on ideology, on prejudice, on preconception, and not based on science, right? So let's go. The first international migration of humans are believed to have happened around 60,000 years ago. International migration is geographical movement involving a change in residence that crosses the boundaries of two or more countries, as we have been discussing already. International migration has both positive and negative effects, both on the areas of origin and destination. And like I said, what's our point of view? Are we looking at the effects of international migration at the area of destination? We're doing an analysis of immigration. Or are we looking at the effects of international migration on the areas of origin? We are doing an analysis of immigration. So immigration refers to the movement of people to a new country for the purpose of establishing permanent residence. An immigrant is a person who crosses an international boundary with the intention to permanently live in a new country. Immigration refers to the permanent departure of people from a country. So in this analysis here, I'm focusing on the analysis of how a specific country that lost people as immigrants, how that affects that area. And an immigrant is a person who moves away from a country with the intention to establish a permanent residence somewhere else. So, and of course, like in a long term immigration, in every internal migration flow, a migrant is both an immigrant and an immigrant. And it depends on our point of view as researchers, what is our focus? Is our focus based, usually when we are talking about the US, we are looking from the point of view of the area of destination. We are looking at immigration. Long-term immigration is the residence establishment in the destination country, and it's what is a permanent residence. The criterion is the same one as internal migration. It's people who move from one country to the other to stay there and live there for at least 1 year. Those people are considered long-term immigrants, people who move into a country and live there for at least 1 year. Long-term immigrants are those who left one specific country and stay outside for at least 1 year. Long-term immigrants comprise around 3.2% of the world's population, based on data from 2013. And this number has been increasing a lot in recent decades. So it increased from 75 million in 1964 to around 232 million in 2013. And the civil war in Syria made those numbers increase a lot, exactly because of so many Syrians being refugees, moving to Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and also to European countries. Return migration is another important topic when we are dealing with international migration. It refers to the return of international migrants back to their home countries. A remigrant is an international migrant who returns back to establish permanent residence in his or her origin country of residence. And return migration can be both voluntary or involuntary. So when we talked about mortality, and we are talking about the Hispanic health paradox, one of the reasons that we might be seeing better health outcomes among the Hispanic population compared to non-Hispanic white is maybe because the older Hispanic population that are immigrants, then we are moving back to their home country to die in their home country. So they don't count as dying in the US, they die in their home country. In that case, it's a return migration for voluntary reasons. People wanted to move back. But in these last decades, in these previous two administrations, we saw an increase on deportations. So deportations of immigrants from the US to their home countries, and usually from the US to Latin America, it's involuntary. So the American government makes those people go back. So deportation, it's one kind of return migration. So return migration is not a rosy thing of people, oh, I want to go back to my home country after being successful. No, it can be also because of deportation, right? So there are different studies that can be done on that topic. Tourists and visitors are different from international migrants. Their visits to another country is usually short-term, and their visits do not involve establishing permanent residence in the destination country. So people who come to the US stay here for 1, 2, 3 months. They are just tourists, or for some weeks or for some days, and they are not international migrants. But what we see in more recent decades is that people enter the US with a tourist visa and overstay their visas, overstay their tourist visas. In that case, they enter as tourists, they overstay their visas, so they become undocumented immigrants by overstaying their visas. That's something that we're going to discuss more in this chapter. And then when they overstay their visas and they live here in the US for at least a year, they become immigrants, okay? So that one of the major criticisms about increasing the security in the southern border is that most people entering the US undocumented, they're not coming through the southern border. They enter with tourist visas and they just overstay their visas and live here longer. Overall, that there are like these 4 major groups of immigrants in the world. Refugee or exilee is someone who involuntarily immigrates from his or her native country to usually a neighboring country due to persecution, violence, and deprivation. That happened a lot in these last decades in African countries, and more recent years, we see that a lot in Syria because of the Syrian civil war. Migrant from a former colony is someone who moves from a decolonized country to its former imperial country, seeking better living conditions. So that's really clear in the case of countries in Africa that were colonized by European countries, and exactly because there is this tie between these countries, it still ends because of they know the language of the European countries that colonized them in the past. There is still this migration from these former colonies in Africa, for example, to European countries. In the US, we see the major example here is the economic migrant. Is someone who voluntarily moves to live in a destination country for economic reasons. So most of the people moving to the US, they are also refugees and exilees as well, but most of the people moving to the US, they are coming from other countries all over the world to get better job opportunities and life conditions in the US. And an ethnic privileged migrant is someone who is a descendant of a nation's ethnic core group living outside of the mother country for generations. So that happens a lot in developing countries. For example, in Brazil, receives a lot of well-educated and people with high socioeconomic status from Europe, people moving to Brazil, usually to live even in rural areas or even in big cities, but they are moving to those places not because they are looking for better economic conditions. They are just living to those countries for the lifestyle, a different lifestyle that they want to have in those countries of destination. They are not refugees. They are not from a former colony. They are usually from European countries and moving to these other developing countries because of lifestyle, the way that they want to live. So there are these different groups. The groups that we have more in the US is economic migrants, but the refugees is a group of international migrants that have been driving a lot the rates of international migrant up in this last decade because of all these different conflicts around the world. This is a slide from another study from another paper. There is this report funded by the National Academy of Science about integration of immigrants. And this report has around 500 pages, so much longer than my dissertation era. So it's this one here. The 2015. This is the last slide in this lecture. The references. The integration of immigrants into American society funded by the National Academies of Science. If you just Google it, you can download it. And I just got from that publication this definition of generations related to international migrants. Because whenever we're talking about generation of immigrants, it's kind of like difficult to understand what exactly we're talking about. So I wanted to take some time here to explain. So first generation immigrants in the US, who are those? Those are people that are born in a different country and live here in the US now. So that's my case, for example, born in Brazil and live in the US. 1.5th generation are those that are also born in another country, but they arrived to the country of destination when they were children. Usually we calculate those people that moved into a country up to age 12 as being 1.5th generation. Why we do that? Because those people that move to a specific country of destination up to age 12, they will go to a great portion of their school in the country of destination. They will learn the English. They won't have an accent. They will be much more integrated, right? And we can subdivide this group of 1.5th generation into 1.25th, 1.5th, or 1.25th generation. Those that came from 13 to 18, 6 to 12, and those that came here so young, from 0 to 5 years of age, those people are pretty much, they will live most of their life in the US, that their overall experience will be much closer to the experience of the second generation. And the second generation, what are those? Those are people born in the US, but their parents are born somewhere else. And this is a really interesting thing to talk here. When I say that, oh, these are second generation immigrants. Here at A&M, there are several second generation immigrants. And when you talk to them, when you talk to them about regular things in life and everything, for me as a first generation, it's really, really, really hard for me to distinguish between second and third. Because second generation are pretty much people born in the US, they are US born people, but parents born outside. Although they have the influence at home to maybe learn another language, all their experience in their lives all these experiences were lived here in the US, which is really close to those people who also entered early, the 1.75th generation. And we can also make a distinction between the second and the 2.5th generation. The second would be those that don't have, they have no US born parents. So both parents, mother and father, born outside. And the 2.5th generation are those in which one of the parents is US born and the other one foreign born. So my children, for example, my wife is born in the US. My children are 2.5th generation. Since kindergarten, going to school here, at home, I speak with my wife in English, so my influence of teaching them Portuguese, Brazilian culture, much higher challenge. Their experience as 2.5th generation is going to be much closer to the third generation, right? But for a first generation person, distinguishing between these three here, it's really, really difficult. And the third generation are those that are at least grandchildren of immigrants. Both of their parents are born in the US, they are US born, and both of their parents are US born as well. Maybe they have grandparents born outside, but they are already third generation. And then from then on, we just call a third plus generation. The third generation are those that have at least one grandparent born outside. But then it becomes so distant that we just say that those that are born in the US and parents born in the US, they are third generation or third plus generation. But this distinction here, in practice, when we are doing these studies, is important because it gives us some idea of integration of the population. Overall, first generation immigrants, they come with lower socioeconomic status than the overall population in the US. The second generation increases a lot, and they get closer to the average socioeconomic status of the third generation. And the third generation of immigrants, those that have grandparents born outside, actually their achievement is a little lower than the second. Right? I'm the first generation. Work hard to give to my children and I pass that to them. But I still have lower socioeconomic status than the overall third generation in this country. My children are well motivated, they improve. But then their children on average will have a slowdown because they become more Americans, right? So that's what the data shows us. That's what I'm going to show you guys here throughout this lecture. But for me, always, like when I was a grad student here at UT, what I saw is that Brazilians who got into the US and they came here at the time of their college, I could not distinguish them from other Americans. Because when they come during college, then they learn all these slangs and everything, and then they lose accent and they become completely integrated into the country. So the age in which you arrive is important. And in my case here, I'm talking about people entering between 18 and 22. I'm being even more flexible than this classification that's been done in the report, right? And it's just to show that that matters. The year that you enter, which year, how old you were when you enter the destination country. And this classification here, it's not always used in other countries, might not make sense in other countries, but in the US is usually the standard. And Douglas Massey already talked to you about him, and we're going to talk about him again because we discussed about Douglas Massey in the theories of the lecture about theories of demography. Within theories of demography, we discuss theories of international migration. And he has a lot of studies discussing the reasons of why people migrate from one country to the other. And overall, as summarized in our textbook, immigration is a lot easier to start than to stop. Actions taken to restrict immigration often have the opposite effect, as we're going to see here, because these actions are usually just politically, ideologically driven. They are not scientifically driven. If they were scientifically driven, we maybe would be successful in our actions. The fundamental causes of immigration may be outside the control of policymakers, exactly because immigrants understand immigration much better than politicians and academics. And because immigrants understand immigration better than policymakers, immigrants are often able to circumvent policies aimed at stop them. We're going to discuss here that at the end of the 1980s, there was this huge increase in border security in the US. And even with this huge increase, it had the opposite effect as intended. Instead of people entering, staying here for a little bit and going back, they entered and stayed in the US. even with the increase because of the increase in border security. Once people get in, was more difficult, but once they got in, they didn't go back. And that changed the composition of the American population. And we're going to discuss more about it. The next topic here is this association between development and migration. It's already 4:30, so I won't have time to discuss this, and this deserves more time. But it's the idea, this slide here can be summarized in this graph. Countries that have higher levels of development usually attracts more immigrants. Countries that are really low levels of development, people have not so much money, so they won't have money to move to other countries, so low levels of immigrants. Once these countries reach kind of mid-levels of development, they will start to have more money to move to other countries, buy air ticket and so on, afford international travels. But once those countries increase a lot the levels of development, then they will tend to stay and they will not tend to immigrate so much anymore. But I will go back to this discussion in the next class, okay? So thank you very much. And I see you guys on Thursday. We have pretty much only 3 classes left, Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday, and then the final exam. Okay? Thank you very much, and I see you guys on Thursday.